Mrs. Smith noticed something was off with 7-year-old Miguel. He used to be one of her best students, always dedicated and hardworking. But lately, he was failing his tests and didn't seem as focused on his schoolwork. Miguel started coming to school looking exhausted and hungry, and Mrs. Smith couldn't figure out what was wrong. She and his family had moved to America from South Africa and thought they might be facing some difficulties. One day, Mrs. Smith decided to talk to Miguel's parents, but they insisted everything was fine. That was until she found Miguel on the street, looking sad and worn out. After a long day at work, Mrs. Smith was walking to her car where she suddenly saw Miguel. He was sitting on a cardboard box with his homework spread out in front of him, trying to study. "Miguel," she cried, approaching him. "What are you doing here, darling?" The boy squinted his eyes due to the sun's rays as he looked up. "Mrs. Smith," he asked, "I'm just finishing up my homework." "Here," she gasped. "Out on the streets like this? Why? Where are your parents?" Suddenly, she noticed the boy's eyes well up. "They are not good," he said sadly. "I can't stay with them. We don't even have a home anymore." Mrs. Smith was heartbroken as Miguel began sharing his story with her. He said that when they first arrived in the country, they were living with relatives who had recently kicked them out. His parents were now living in a shelter, but it was dreadful in every sense of the word. Miguel didn't have a desk or table to do his homework on in the shelter, and it was too noisy, so he did it on a cardboard box in the street and went back to the shelter only to sleep. He said he couldn't concentrate on his studies there and didn't know where to go until he found the spot on the street behind the school. "Mama and Dada make money with great trouble," he said. "I have to study and do well. I need to help them." Mrs. Smith knew she had to do something to help her student. She asked Miguel to return to his parents at the shelter, promising she'd make arrangements for him to study. And she followed through on her promise. She arrived at school early the next day and arranged a small desk in the back of her classroom for Miguel. She also bought him extra school supplies and the permit to stay back after lessons and do his homework in the classroom. Mrs. Smith decided to meet Miguel's parents once his homework problem was resolved. Unaware, she'd discover another heartbreaking detail about the young boy's life. Miguel's mother was deaf and his father no longer had a job. The immigrant parents were overwhelmed with gratitude when Mrs. Smith told them how she had allowed Miguel to stay back at school after classes and helped him with his homework. "It's difficult for us here," Miguel's father, Mr. Nkosi, told her. "We don't get jobs because they don't want to hire us. I was cleaning the pavements outside a store until a week ago. I no longer have that job, Mr. Nkosi," Mrs. Smith said. "I can't promise anything, but I can talk to the school principal and see if he can help your family. After all, your son, Miguel, is a very bright and talented student, and I don't want a good kid like him to miss out on a brighter future." Mrs. Smith and her husband never had children, but her heart had always craved kids. Probably it was the lack of her own children that made her sympathetic toward Miguel. So the next day, Mrs. Smith approached the school principal and told him about Miguel's story. Mr. Randolph was moved, and he was eager to assist the young boy's family. He contacted the school cafeteria committee right away, and Miguel's mother was hired at the school cafeteria. But despite helping the family, Mrs. Smith knew Miguel's problems were far from over because he and his parents still didn't have a proper home to live in. She knew she could provide them with shelter in her house and even suggested it to her husband, but he refused and was furious. "They're freaking immigrants. They might be just pretending to be helpless for all we know," he snapped. "How gullible are you? How can you trust strangers?" "Josh," Mrs. Smith cried. "For God's sake, stop discriminating against them. That kid, well, he is so bright and his parents are very kind and gracious. They were so grateful to me when I told them about the small help I had given their child. You're overreacting." "Overreacting?" he fumed. "You can't tell the difference between generosity and stupidity. There are so many immigrant families in the country. Are you going to go and help everyone?" "Well," Mrs. Smith said calmly, "no, I'm afraid I can't. But I know I can help this one family, and if I get the chance, I'm not going to let anyone, not even my husband, stop me. This is also my home, and they'll be staying here. If you are not comfortable with them staying here, you can find a place at a friend's house. Teaching is about treating everyone equally and helping people regardless of who they are or where they come from. It's not only about reading books and passing on knowledge. It's more about showing your students care and compassion, but you wouldn't know because you're not a teacher, Josh." She was crying when she felt a reassuring tap on her shoulder. For Miguel's family, Mrs. Smith was an angel who had turned their lives around. Not only did she help them stand on their feet, she also gave them a roof over their heads. Mrs. Smith was praised at school for her good deeds, and her students learned a valuable lesson in empathy and kindness. She also aided the students in learning basic sign language to communicate with Miguel's mother in the school cafeteria. Little could they have guessed what awaited them. Little Miguel was happy and so grateful to Mrs. Smith for everything she'd done. He was thankful to Mr. Smith too, although he didn't particularly like the Incosis staying at the house. But despite everything, things were going swimmingly for Miguel and his family. With Mrs. Smith's help, the boy was able to focus on his studies and get his grades back on track, and he was overjoyed to have his own desk to do his homework on. Years passed, and Mrs. Smith remained Miguel's mentor and advocate, helping him achieve his goals. In the blink of an eye, the 7-year-old Miguel grew up, graduated high school, and it had been years since he and his family had moved out. Mrs. Smith could never forget the Incosis. They gained a special place in her heart, and she had no idea they'd cross paths again, at a time when she had no help, no hope in life. Years after Miguel's family left, Mrs. Smith's husband left her for a younger Puerto Rican woman and suitor. Since their house was in his name, Mrs. Smith was on the brink of becoming homeless. By then, she was retired, and her savings wouldn't allow her to afford a lawyer. The poor woman was crying in a cafe one day, thinking she'd have to live on the streets because her life had come to an end, when she felt a reassuring tap on her shoulder. "May I help?" a voice then asked her. Mrs. Smith looked up and turned around. She couldn't keep her tears at bay when she saw Miguel. He looked so charming, so different in a pristine suit. "Oh, darling," she sobbed, throwing open her arms and embracing him. "How have you been?" "I'm so good, Mrs. Smith," he said gratefully, "and it's all because of you." "What happened to you, though? Why are you crying by yourself?" "I was here for a client meeting, and there's still time for it, so may I ask if I can help you?" The poor teacher broke down as she told Miguel everything. "Well, let me help you then," he said. "I'm a lawyer, Mrs. Smith. I pursued law after graduating high school, and it was all possible thanks to you. You helped me when I needed you, so let me repay you." But the older woman hesitated. "I'm afraid I can't afford your fees, darling. I can't." "I never asked for it, Mrs. Smith," he assured her. "All I need is a little help from you to understand the case better and the legal documents your husband would have sent. May I visit you later today?" Mrs. Smith couldn't contain her tears. "Angel," she whispered. "You're an angel. What do you call it?" "Yes, the knight in shining armor." Miguel laughed. I don't know if I call myself that. "Because you were my knight in shining armor when I needed you, Mrs. Smith. This is the bare minimum I can do for you." Miguel visited Mrs. Smith later that day, and he carefully studied the documents sent to her by the court. Since Mr. Smith had filed for divorce and Mrs. Smith was no longer capable of supporting herself, she was entitled to alimony. Miguel represented Mrs. Smith in the court, and they won. He was not only able to get her alimony, but also a rightful share of the assets. After the trial, however, Mrs. Smith was upset, even though her husband had lost, because she felt betrayed and hurt. She couldn't keep her tears at bay as she thought about how happy she'd been with her husband, although he wasn't the best man. She reached into her purse to grab her handkerchief and suddenly felt something thick, like a box, in her hand. Mrs. Smith pulled it out of her bag to see a brightly wrapped present. Opening it, she found a lovely necklace with a heart-shaped pendant inside. "Did you like it?" asked Miguel, taking his seat beside her. "I made it for you with my hands." Mrs. Smith couldn't say a word. Tears rolled down her soft cheeks, and Miguel hugged her, telling her that everything would be okay, that she would be okay. But there was more. After Mrs. Smith and Miguel left the courtroom and stepped outside, she was shocked to see a brand new fancy car pull up in front of them. Miguel's parents got out and handed her the keys. "This is from my family," Miguel said. "I wanted to thank you for everything you did for us years ago. Now I want to help you just like you helped me when I needed it. Please accept this." With tears in her eyes, Mrs. Smith looked at Miguel's family and then up at the beautiful orange sky as the sun's rays shone down on them. Life wasn't so bad after all. She was surrounded by people who loved, admired, and cared for her. So what if Josh wasn't in her life anymore? She could still find happiness. With that thought, Mrs. Smith felt ready to start a new chapter in her life, and she knew she wouldn't look back.